live. Let's see. My microphone is showing that things are working, so that's good news. Welcome back to PHIL-1006, The Great Philosophers, Fanshawe College in the summer of 2020. We're back online. I'm going to try to condense these slides as best I can. Feeling a little off today. Might be allergies. I'm not sure what's going on. I just want a nap, I guess. So let me just direct your attention to a couple things on the course website, then I'll give you a brief overview of this, the content this time around. So if we are looking at the FOL site under evaluations, quizzes, right? If you click evaluations, quizzes, you'll find that the midterm is here, right? Due May 29th, modules 1 to 8, open book, open notes. So you have till May 29th to complete it, which is what, Friday? Yeah. I realize that this includes the material for this week, right? Module 7, Module 8. So what you'll have to do is get a little bit ahead. Make sure you look at those, and I'll be lecturing on Module 8 on Thursday, so if you want to complete it Friday, that's fine. Just make sure you do get that midterm in on time. In terms of other things that are due for this class, Online Quiz 3 will open June 1st. Again, because this is an accelerated course where a whole semester is packed into, 7 weeks, things are going to be coming at you very fast. I am grading your essays right now so far. Really nice job. I'm enjoying reading them. And then the next thing will be the kind of second essay, but you can worry about that in a couple weeks in June. All right. Let's talk about Hume and Immanuel Kant. Thanks for joining me on the live stream if you're watching. If you're watching later, that's great too. If you have any questions and you're live, type something in the chat. If you're not watching live, send me an email. I've been pretty good about answering emails, maybe not on the weekends. It's a little hectic in my household, as you can imagine. I got a couple kids that are not going to school until the fall. But I'm doing my best to get back to you as quickly as possible. All right, so let's talk about David Hume and Immanuel Kant. So we're talking about people who are very much kind of, Renaissance, early modern, Enlightenment era figures. I have some dates here, right? David Hume, 18th century, so 1711, 1776. Probably the most important figure in this kind of period of British empiricism. So if you're thinking British empiricism, you should also be thinking Locke, you should be thinking Hobbes, you should also be thinking Berkeley. I don't know if we're talking about Berkeley in this class, but really a pivotal central figure in this kind of period of philosophy, in this kind of 18th century, what we call early modern and Enlightenment kind of era. And I'm going to be contrasting his views with Immanuel Kant. German professor of philosophy, 1724, 1804, so very much a contemporary of Hume. And Kant wrote that it was Hume that woke him from his dogmatic slumber and realized that he needed to be more original in his philosophy, because Hume, as an empiricist, was also a bit of a skeptic. And we'll see why Hume's arguments kind of made Kant feel like he really needed to answer these problems that Hume was raising. So let's get started. Yeah, here they are. Is this the same picture? Same pictures. So Hume, fundamentally, Hume was kind of a common sense empirical realist in the sense that he, believed in what you could see. And he didn't have a lot of time for thinking about airy, abstract metaphysical theories. For example, he was not a big fan of Cartesian dualism in the sense that there's two different kinds of substances. It seemed to be a complex solution looking for a problem, right, and not a solution to a problem. Descartes had the solution and just like, where's a problem I can apply this, because he really wanted to believe in dualism. So Hume was skeptical of complex theories, and his approach is generally to counsel doubt, open-mindedness, caution, common sense, belief in sensory experiences, and in general suspicion of complex metaphysical theories. In his time, he did have a bit of a bad reputation. Not for kind of a, I mean, people call each other atheists back then, no matter what you thought, as long as if you disagreed, you were an atheist automatically. Um, but he did have these really skeptical writings on religion. He kind of put forward the idea that religion was just kind of a natural human phenomenon, an anthropological phenomenon. Um, which is a strain of thought that someone like Daniel Dennett later would take up. But the basic idea is that religion is kind of like a local cuisine. No matter where you go in the world, you're gonna find a style of food. And Hume says, no matter where you go in the world, you're gonna find a style of religion, and there's nothing wrong with any of them. But don't make the mistake of believing one of them is the truth. Which, of course, in the 18th century, you say stuff like that, you might get in trouble. So he argued against all the traditional proofs of God's existence. We're not going to be going over these. I'm not going to talk about his argument against the idea of miracles, but there are links here if you're interested. So Hume was very much a bit like Hobbes, but more straightforwardly so, a skeptic about religion. Part of his view here was that really knowledge comes from sense experience, and as a result of this empiricism, we should doubt metaphysical ideas as not grounded in something real, which is something we can observe or perceive. So Hume, like Locke, thinks, look, there's a distinction between a complex idea and a basic sense impression. Right? Impressions are what we see. Ideas are the recollections of what we see. But all our ideas are grounded in some sense impression. Again, somewhat similarly to Locke, the mind will combine elements of our impressions to create things that aren't real, to create kind of false ideas. And an important aspect of philosophy is not to have positive theories. Is an important aspect of philosophy for Hume is to get rid of false ideas, to locate them and eliminate them. Because if they can't be grounded in sense experience, probably they should be rejected. So philosophy is a kind of mental hygiene where you get rid of bad ideas. And that's just as important as creating good theories. So creating an account of the world is an important part of philosophy, but just as important is getting rid of the bad accounts of the world, getting rid of stuff that probably isn't real, doesn't exist, doesn't explain properly. So philosophy is as much a skeptical project as a theoretical one. Or as he says, if we take our hands any volume, let us ask, does it contain abstract reasoning, containing quantity or number? No. Does it contain experimental reasoning, concerning matters of fact and existence? Then, if it's also no, then commit it to the flames, for it contains nothing but sophistry and illusion. So look, Hobbes, don't take him literally. He's not saying we should go burn books. He says we should be skeptical of arguments that are not based on either two things, right? Empirical science, or if we're going to be using just reasoning, the reasoning has to be about quantity or number. So rationalism is good if it's about math and nothing else. If it's about anything else, it should be grounded in experimental reasoning. Otherwise, don't trust the theory. So, I feel like I've talked about a theory, empirical or empiricist theories of mind when we talked about Locke a little bit. So, again, Hume is similar to Locke. Simple ideas are derived from simple impressions, and then complex ideas are made up of simples. So the idea here is the mind is representational. It engages in what we might think of as computations on like simpler objects. And it's really a shame that Hume didn't live to see like 20th, 21st century kind of explosion in computational mathematics, because he would have been super excited by this. So it's kind of too bad. But yeah, Hume and Locke, very similar theory of ideas. One thing Hume probably did better than Locke is give really nice arguments for empiricism. So one of his really intriguing arguments for empiricism is that which is the view that sense impressions always come before ideas. He says, look, for example, imagine a sequence of shades of blue going from lighter to darker. If there's a missing shade in the sequence, and you know there's a missing shade, like right in the middle of these two, do you have a really clear visual idea of that color prior to actually experiencing it? He says, unless they've seen it, you can't really visualize it. You can't just reason your way into the missing shade of blue here. In other words, experiences come before ideas. Now, a color for Hume is a basic sense impression. It's a simple from which more complex things are built. And if the simple is missing from your experiences, you can't reason your way to it. You need to experience it. All right, again, a missing shade of blue in a sequence, a missing simple sense impression cannot be given to you by reason alone. This is a very interesting argument, in part because it's kind of it is itself an empirical argument about what humans are able to do. Um, Now, whenever I teach this in class, somebody inevitably raises their hands and says, I think I can picture this missing shade of blue. Maybe they can, maybe they can't. We'd have to do some research here, but it's a really intriguing kind of psychological cog-sci style argument, which really is Hume at his best when he's giving these kinds of fascinating empirical arguments here. Um, so if Hume is an empiricist on the basis of arguments like these, he's obviously going to be against Descartes, the rationalist of his day. Hume claims Descartes' argument doesn't work. Now, if you remember, Descartes said we have to be rationalists because we can doubt everything in sense experience, but there's one thing within reason we don't doubt, which is that there is a thinking self. The cogito, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, shows there as a self that we can't doubt. And we know this outside of any experience. Um, but Hume claims, no, we don't really perceive a self. We can't prove there's a self. Introspection, he says, yields, quote, nothing but a bundle or collection of perception, which succeed each other with rapidity, are in perpetual flux and movement. What Hume is trying to argue here is that the cogito goes wrong by thinking of consciousness as a thing that is independent of sense experience, um, which is wrong. What he says is consciousness of an object, but there's no consciousness of consciousness itself, and thus there is no self, Hume says. You can't be conscious of your own consciousness. You can only be conscious of the object of your consciousness, what your consciousness is thinking of. So what Descartes says kind of doesn't make sense. What you should say is, I think, therefore there is thinking, not I think, therefore I am. Again, I really wish we were in a classroom because the missing shade of blue argument, the you're not conscious of your consciousness argument usually yields a lot of like interesting questions and argument in a classroom context, but I'm just here on YouTube, so you're gonna have to head over to the discussion forum and tell me what you think. The discussion forums, by the way, since I'm talking about them, are not graded. They're just there so you can interact with your classmates, and that if I see you're posting and you want an extension on something, then I'll give you the extension on the paper, on the midterm, or whatever. Okay, so here's another skeptical argument. Again, Hume is a great skeptical empiricist. It's kind of his whole thing. He's skeptical of other people's theories. So he's going to be skeptical about causation. This is great because it shows that he's an equal opportunity skeptic. It's not just, I'm skeptical about rationalism, I'm skeptical about religion, I'm skeptical about Descartes. He's going to be skeptical in some sense about science. So causation is, of course, cause and effect. The idea that in the universe we observe regularities, and on the basis of these regularities we can create scientific theories that are predictive. So causation is really a key component to scientific reasoning, which was just kind of getting off the ground. So causation is central to induction, which is a form of scientific reasoning opposed to deduction. You can look these terms up if you want. And what we call ampliative inference. This one I should explain. An ampliative inference moves from a small data set to a statement about a larger data set. Think about an opinion poll. We're amplifying the results of our poll to a whole population, right? So if I have a good poll, I am giving a survey to 1,000 people. And if that 1,000 people is a representative sample of the wider population, my amplitude of inference is the result of that poll can be applied to the entire population. So suppose I poll 1,000 Canadians and they say that, I don't know, they like chocolate chip ice cream, 52% like chocolate chip ice cream. It's a stupid example. Um, then we can say of the general Canadian public, roughly half like chocolate chip ice cream. Um, with give or take, 5 percentage points of error, et cetera, et cetera. That's amplitude of inference because we're taking a small data set, we're applying, and we assume the results hold of a larger data set. And Hume is skeptical about this very process. He says it's only causation which produces a connection as to give us assurance from the existence or action of one object that was followed or preceded by another existence or action. The statistical example is not a great example of causation, since the poll doesn't cause a thing, but it was just an example of amplitude inference. So causation is more like a billiard ball physics, right? If I, hit the cue ball and it hits another ball, right? It's, we can see that it's the force of one is transmitted to the other, and that's causation. But for Hume, any kind of causation in nature that we observe and theorize on can't be like a substance or fundamental principle because we can't observe it. We only observe the connection. What we never observe is causation itself. Causation applies to many different types of things. Right? Think of all the cause and effect relationships that you can imagine. Whether it's a cause and effect in physics, in psychology, in sociology, political science, biology. He rejects the idea that there's something unifying across all scientific domains we can just call causation. And in particular, he rejects, and this is part of his attacks on the traditional proofs of God's existence, he rejects the idea that everything must have a cause. He says, look, the idea that everything has a cause is not a statement of logic. It's not a statement of mathematics. It's something that can't be proved a priori. But if it's not a statement of logic, it must be grounded in experience. We must derive our knowledge of causation from our sense impressions. But we never perceive a causal relation. We only have the regular connection of two events, and then we assume causation is occurring. This is going to get a little tricky here because the argument is going to be a circularity argument made under a few assumptions, right? The assumptions in particular is that causation is not logical, it's not a logical relation, and it's not an observable relation. We don't see causation as such, we see regular connection and we infer causation. And the inference that causation exists itself has to be an empirical inference, but this is circular. Induction is scientific induction, which is the process by which we kind of like take a small set and we kind of make an observation about a general set. It's going to be circular because a theory of causation, because it's not a logical statement and it can't be observed directly, a theory of causation has to be gained from induction, from scientific observation. So the hypothesis that causation exists has to be confirmed by the constant connection of events. However, the process of induction that shows us causation is real can't be justified without assuming causation already. So it's circular. So the problem here, again, I'm sorry if I've lost you here, but just think about the circularity in the following argument, okay? An inductive argument, a scientific argument, concludes roughly that the future, I'm making a prediction, right? Scientific theories predict, the future will resemble the past on the basis, why do I believe the future will resemble the past? Well, in the past, the future has resembled the past. Well, how do we know that in the future will continue resembling the past? Well, it's not a logical argument. There's no deductive argument for this. And we can't say induction is justified because it has worked so far, because we're trying to justify the very principle, right? You can't inductively justify induction. That's circular, right? I can't assume my predictions about the future will hold because in the past my predictions about the future have held. Now, how do I know induction works? Well, it used to work. Right? Hume will say that's circular. You can either prove that causation is a reasonable hypothesis using deduction or induction. It's clearly not deductive. There's no logical argument for causation. It has to be inductive. But induction relies on causation, which is the view that in the past, causal relations have created relationships between observations and predictions. But that's exactly what we're trying to prove. So we have a problem of circularity, right? Our knowledge is based on the principle of cause and effect. The principle of cause and effect is grounded in induction. Induction relies on uniformity, i.e. that the future will resemble the past. We come to know this from experience, but our knowledge of experience is based on cause and effect, and we're caught in a problem of circularity. Whoops. So this is a very complex argument again, but roughly we have a problem of circularity of induction. And the problem roughly is that we have two options for justifying induction. One is deductive, it doesn't work. One is inductive, and the only justification for induction can't be itself. So we have a problem. One final skeptical insight from Hume before I turn to Kant. How am I doing for time here? 26 minutes. Oh boy. Hume also argues you can get an ought from an is. What does this mean? An ought is a normative statement. It's a moral statement, a statement what you ought to do, what you should do. It's an ethical statement. Now, Hume is going to argue that you can't get a moral statement out of a factual statement. Facts entail no normative truths. A normative truth is a truth about norms, about ethics, about obligations, about duties, whatever moral truths, however you conceptualize them. A statement of fact can't get you a moral truth. Morality and facts are separate. Every moral argument and conclusion has a moral premise. Right? To establish a moral conclusion, you must have a moral premise. There can be no natural ground for morality, which means that no facts can justify any particular moral conclusion. Right? Hume ultimately thinks morality is grounded in emotion and empathy, not reason, not nature. Again, this has to do with arguments that are skeptical of natural law, which was a very prominent kind of theological approach to normative ethics, that there's natural law, it has to do with functions, the proper functions God intended in nature, for example. And Hume is very skeptical of these kinds of theories. So I've been talking about this in very abstract terms. What does it mean that you can't get an ought from an is? You can't get morality out of any statement of fact. Suppose I give you a factual claim. Now, it could be true or false. Let's pretend it's true. Suppose it's true that, quote, this is going to be a controversial example, but bear with me. Suppose we hold it's true that the fetus is a person. Can we conclude from this statement of fact alone that it is immoral to kill the fetus, that abortion is morally wrong? Hume would say, no, we can't. Because suppose this is a statement of fact, the fetus is a human person. By itself, we also require a moral premise. We should never kill a person, right? A fetus is a person. We should never kill a person, right? There's the should statement. Therefore, it is immoral to kill a fetus. But we need both. The factual statement by itself doesn't tell us anything moral. Right? Again, this is very kind of anti-Aristotelian. If you remember Aristotle's ethics, right? That was very kind of a naturalistically grounded theory. But Hume says, no, you can't do that. To understand a moral argument, Hume says, is to understand that either premise can be disputed. Personhood as a statement of fact, and the nature of the morality of what counts as justifiable killing. But we need both. Moral conclusions, moral arguments have factual and moral premises. So, and non-moral facts are insufficient to ground morality. So, again, we have a circularity problem, in that you can't get morality out of anything else but morality. Every moral conclusion has a moral premise. Period. All of them, right? Also, and it's pretty obvious here, right? We should never kill a person is itself a conclusion that we can, right? Well, we obviously do think there's such cases. There's cases of self-defense, there's cases of warfare. You can have views about capital punishment and so on. What counts as killing? Is there a difference between doing versus allowing harm, right? So all these things are very fraught concepts, and Hume says we can never escape the fact that all moral arguments have themselves moral premises. So a moral theory can't be grounded in facts about nature, and it can't be grounded in rationality independently of morality either. So just to sum up, Hume, skeptical empiricist, right? He's skeptical about metaphysical theories, skeptical about religion, skeptical about Descartes, skeptical about science, right, and causation, and skeptical about morality itself. Ultimately, right, morality is grounded in empathy and emotion, but not reason. So here's the point at which Kant reads Hume and goes like, all right, we got to do something about this. This is too much skepticism. All right, philosophy's going to hit a roadblock. Right? It's really hard to reconcile science with religion. Descartes tried with dualism. Dualism has a bunch of problems. Right? How do the two substances interact? Nobody knows. Hume comes up and says you can't even secure science on its own terms because there's no way of justifying the idea of induction or causal relations. If you are a strict rationalist, at best, you're going to end up with Spinoza, which is kind of weird, kind of pantheism, right, in order to solve the problems of dualism. If you're an empiricist, well, you're probably going to end up like a Humean skeptic. So Kant, who was roused from his dogmatic slumbers by Hume, wanted to compromise a little bit, say, look, okay, we need to figure out these problems. We need to ground ethics, and we need to ground science and knowledge. That's what he's going to do. He's going to try to do that in his philosophy. So I'm going to do very briefly, and this kind of hurts my heart a little bit because Kant, any one of his books is just a semester in and of itself. But I have about 15 minutes to talk about one of the most complex and influential philosophers of the 18th century. But let's try. So we're going to focus on two of Hume's challenges. One, Hume's attack on causality. Says, look, there's no necessary connection between events. We can't observe causality, and we cannot, from our observations of connection, deduce the presence of causality without committing a circularity problem. Second, Hume claimed all moral arguments rely on a moral premise. Likewise, morality is circular, right? Thus, we can only ground morality in some non-rational means, such as our emotions, right? So it's kind of this brute fact. We have empathy, we have emotions, and it's our sentiments ultimately that lead us to have moral feelings. And these moral feelings are put into rational sounding words, but ultimately the grounding is not rational. The grounding is empathetic, emotive, sentimental. So Kant is going to try and argue against these views. Kant wanted to kind of combine elements of rationalism and empiricism. He wanted to generate through it an epistemology and a metaphysics and a theory of morality that could kind of get around Hume's skepticism. So his synthesis is going to say very roughly that, yes, our knowledge of the world comes from our senses. True. However, our reason plays an important role in determining how perception operates because the mind will contribute to our perception by structuring these percepts. And we will perceive the world in necessary ways as a result of the way our brain is structured. We will view the world in specific ways because our mind is interpreting the data in a necessary way, and that we can't get around that. So we just have information coming in from the outside world that our brain is going to structure and turn into perception. But the information itself is distinct from our perception of it. All right, let me see if I can give you an example of that before I go into one of Kant's own examples. Right? Think about color. Now today we know, where's my water bottle? Right, so this is my purple water bottle. It's kind of purplish, right? What is a color? Well, modern science tells us that color is wavelengths of light. So what we have is that you can think of the electromagnetic spectrum as being sorted into different frequencies and wavelengths. And these frequencies and wavelengths, when they bounce off an object and activate the cones and rods in our eye, are then perceived as color. Now, do we actually think that a wavelength of light is purple itself? Well, no, of course not. A wavelength of light is just like a sine wave or something, right? It's a certain frequency of energy. It is the mind that takes this information and says, I will present you this information as purple or red or blue or whatever. But the purple is in here, but it's true, the information, the wavelength is out there in the world, but the purple's in here. So the mind will necessarily structure information and turn it into perception. And you cannot escape this. Try as I might, I will always think of, right, this water bottle as purple, but I can't look at it and tell you, yes, this wavelength of light is 90 nanometers in length, or I don't actually know what the frequency is of different colors. Right? But the point is, there's information. The real world exists. However, the mind will structure information of the real world and turn it into perception. And that perception will be, for example, color vision. I don't have electromagnetic frequency wave perception. I have color perception. And the color is here. Color isn't real. I mean, it's real enough, Kant will say, right? Kant also says, look, we perceive the world as three-dimensional. Right? I cannot imagine a 4 or 5 or 6-dimensional space. Mathematicians can make theories of n-dimensional spaces and make calculations, but what I can't do is have an intuitive perception of a 4-dimensional world. I have a 3-dimensional world. I mean, I'm definitely perceiving a mind-independent external world, right? There is an external world, but my mind is contributing a method of interpretation that I can't get out of. I couldn't perceive it any other way. So what Kant is going to say is that this means the world is necessarily three-dimensional. The world is necessarily has color in it. Likewise, we interpret connection as causal. So causality is necessary. I can't take my causal glasses off. It's just part of how I interpret the world. Now, there's a problem. There's a number of problems with this argument, of course, right? But the idea is the world as it really is not something we can know. What we have is a world that we perceive. So we're perceiving the world, but it's an interpreted world. And because it's necessary and we can't turn it off, right? Anything that is necessary has to be true because it can't be otherwise. Now, there's a number of problems you might think here, which is that didn't my whole example with color necessitate a distinction between the frequencies of the electromagnetic spectrum and my perception of color? Well, you'd be right. There seems to be a distinction here. Didn't I just say we necessarily imagine the world as three-dimensional, but then say, oh yeah, but mathematicians have theories of four-dimensional realities? How is this possible? Well, those are really good objections, but those are kind of 20th century objections. And I don't mean, so put those objections between parentheses for now. The idea for Kant is that if the mind necessarily presents information about the external world using kind of these modes of perception, such as color and space, and we can't get out of it, then they're necessary. And if they're necessary and it can't be otherwise, it's true. So that's how you're going to get causation back. Right? So look at this animated figure here. You're probably interpreting this animated GIF, it's a GIF, as a moving three-dimensional figure. And the parts are kind of weirdly stretching and contracting. But what it is, it's supposed to be a four-dimensional hypercube, a tesseract, a mathematical four-dimensional construct rotating in four spatial dimensions. It's not changing shape at all. What this is 4D perspective translated to a 2D animated GIF. But we're built to see things in 3 dimensions, and we can't see it otherwise. That would be Kant's point. So the idea is that the world will conform to our minds, and both rationalistic idealism and empiricism are going to be true. Both of them are going to be true. So the answer to Hume's skepticism about causality is that causality is a necessary aspect of the mind's interpretation of a mind-independent reality. The mind-independent reality is unknowable. It's unknowable, necessarily speaking, because it would assume there's a view of reality without a view, without a mind to perceive it. But if perception is necessarily structured and you can't escape it, then if it can't be escaped, then the law of causality, whether it's contributed by the mind or by the world, it's irrelevant because they're so fundamentally intertwined. Human reason will perceive everything necessarily as a matter of cause and effect. So it's knowledge of the world and the mind's contribution and structuring of the information coming in. And there's nothing you can do about that. Of course, as science developed, we started creating theories that are more and more divorced from common sense and perception, whether it's in quantum mechanics or whatever. So does Kant survive Einstein, roughly? I think with general relativity, we have a theory that is so counter to common sense about what space and time are that Kant's theory doesn't make a lot of sense anymore. But as a solution, right, for the 18th and 19th century, it was a very good solution. Let's talk a little bit about ethics before we're done here, because how am I doing for time? 41 minutes. These are very complicated philosophers at this point, right? We're far away from Thales of Miletus saying everything's made out of water. So Kant said, Kant also wants to dispute Humean skepticism about morality. Right? Hume's skepticism says you can't get an ought from an is. No facts can get you to morality. Reason can get you to morality. All moral arguments have moral premises. But Kant disagreed. He says right and wrong are a matter of reason, not emotion or anything else. In fact, we can derive ethics purely from our reason. Morality is what he calls the categorical imperative, or should be understood in terms of the categorical imperative, which is a fancy word that I will break down for you. It says morality should be universal. It applies always, and it is binding. It's categorical, and it is imperative. So how you should think about a categorical statement is you should oppose it to like a hypothetical imperative. Hypothetical, right? It means it's a hypothetical scenario. It's like, well, what if, right? So like, look, if you want a result, it's something you should do. But you should only do it if you want the result, right? Should I eat food? Well, only if I'm hungry. That's hypothetical. I shouldn't eat food if I'm not hungry. But what morality is a non-hypothetical imperative. Those things you should do no matter what. You're not doing morality for a reason. You're doing morality for itself. So morality is all the rules that are not hypothetical but categorical concepts. Things you're not going to do hypothetically, but things you just have to do. Right? And he's going to kind of cash this out in many different ways. One of his most famous definitions of the categorical imperative, the thing you have to do for itself and not for another reason, is, quote, act as if the maxim of your action were to become through your will a universal law of nature. Or always act in the way everyone should act in the same situation. Do as you would have others do. Always act as if the maxim of your action, as if the abstract theory guiding your action were to become a universal law of nature. Now, what's my next slide here? Let me give you a couple of examples of what this kind of means and why for Kant this means ethics is grounded in rationality. Morality is grounded in rationality because morality is a set of rules that are not hypothetical. Rationality fundamentally has two features. For something to be rational, it has to be universal. In other words, that it applies across all situations, right? What is rational? 2 plus 2 is 4 is rational, right? I don't need to observe. We talked about this way back in Plato, I think, right? Mathematical truths are universal because you don't need to make a bunch of scientific experiments to make sure that here, I got a couple hair elastics, right? I got one hair elastic, I got two hair elastics, 1 plus 1 is 2. Should I run this experiment again? I got one hair elastic, I got another 1 plus 1 is 2. I don't need to run this experiment, right? This is a universal truth. Aliens believe 1 plus 1 equals 2. So rationality is universal. And another important element of rationality is that it avoids self-contradiction. So universal, non-self-contradictory actions are the ones that will justify themselves and you should always do. So Kant says morality is not contradicting universal rationality. But how do you get morality out of that? Well, let me give you an example, right? Morality is grounded in human actions. So what you want your actions to be are universal and non-contradictory. That's how you know you should actually do a thing. So should I act this way? Well, is it universal? And is it self-contradictory? If it's universal and not self-contradictory, you're probably good to go, right? Because you want to act rationally. So let's say you're not sure. Let's do universality first as a test, right? Let's say you want to cheat on your taxes, right? Let's say you want to work under the table. You have to ask yourself, right? Could this be a universal maxim? Everyone cheat on your taxes. Well, if everyone cheated on their taxes, right? Could this be universally applied? Well, no, because right, society would kind of break down. You're hoping that everyone else keeps paying, but you get to have the benefits of everyone else paying their taxes and you not paying yours. So you get to keep the money and also keep the benefits. So it's not universal. And it's not universal because in a way it's contradictory. Because if you work under the table, Kant says, it doesn't actually have this example, but if we extrapolate from his basic view, right, you're contradicting yourself because the roads you drive on to get to work, the hospitals you go to when you have a sick day, all these things are paid with the taxes other people paid. And if it was a universal law that nobody paid their taxes, you wouldn't be able to go to work. There'd be no roads and no hospitals. Now, of course, you could be a consistent libertarian and say, no, this is exactly what I believe. Nobody should pay taxes and roads and hospitals should be privatized. Well, fine. That's just a libertarian view, but at least it's trying to be consistent, which is the point. Okay, imagine, here's another example, right? Should you cheat? Am I still online? Last time, okay, my connection is still excellent. Should I cheat at cards? Is cheating, like I'm playing poker with my buddies, I got a couple cards in my pocket, I'm going to pull out my ace of spades. Should I cheat at cards? Well, ask yourself, if before I should do this, is it universal and is it not self-contradictory? Well, it can't be universal because the act of universalizing the maxim people should cheat at cards contradicts the very idea of playing a game, because what is constitutive of playing poker is the rules of poker. So if you cheat at poker, you're not behaving rationally because you're undermining the very idea that a game should have rules. And that's how you know it's wrong. Because if everybody cheated, you'd be contradicting yourself by basically admitting that it's okay to pretend as if a game had no rules. But if a game has no rules, it's not a game. So your behavior, you once universalized, becomes contradictory. So notice at no point I had a moral premise here, right? Take that, Hume. All you need for morality is to reflect on rationality, which is universal and consistent, right? So if behavior universalized becomes contradictory, it is immoral, right? And this goes for everything: lying, stealing, right? We should always act as if by universalizing your behavior and verifying for contradiction. That's how Kant thinks we should act. And there's different ways of conceptualizing it as a shortcut, right? You should treat sentient beings never as a means, but as an end in themselves. Kant intends this to be the same thing. It's also important we don't fall into the trap of thinking in terms of the consequences. You know, if for example, and we're going to talk about this next week, I think, next module, right? If I'm talking about the example where should I cheat on my taxes and work under the table, don't think about the consequences of that, because Kant is not into evaluation of consequences, importantly. Um, he's about, because to evaluate consequences, you need morality again, because we're engaging in a moral process of evaluation. We need to be engaging in a logical process of verifying for contradiction. So you might think, oh, if nobody paid their taxes, that would be bad because society would break down. I mean, yes, maybe. However, that doesn't get around Hume's challenge because Hume would go, see, it's bad, but what is bad? Let us talk about bad. You've introduced normative moral language in your argument again. Kant would say, no, 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 I'm not being moral. I'm saying if nobody paid on their taxes, you're contradicting your own behavior because you're behaving as if people are paying their taxes, which is how I get to work, right? On the roads, on the hospitals, on the education system, on municipal water, et cetera, right? So it's really important that we don't understand Kant's view as one in which we're engaged in evaluating the consequences, right? What matters for moral evaluation is accordance with the dictates of reason, with universalization and lack of self-contradiction. Um, and some people are consequentialists in the sense that we have to evaluate the outcomes of an action in terms of a pre-existing moral theory or moral criterion, right? This is consequentialism, sometimes also called utilitarianism. So some people think we should evaluate the consequences, but Kant says we have to act in accordance to universal laws or duties. Um, and I find that if you get into arguments, for example, on the internet about morality, often people, and they don't really realize because they've never read philosophy, but some people are kind of intuitive, unconscious Kantians. They believe in deontology, they believe in duties and universals, and some people are unconscious, intuitive consequentialists. They believe you should evaluate the outcome. Um, for example, how am I doing for time here? I just love the sound of my own voice. I've been live for 50 minutes. Oh my gosh. Um, there's often debates, for example, the United States, about whether you should have condom dispensers in high school bathrooms. Um, the people that support it often point to the outcomes. They say, look, if we just give the kids condoms, I know they're in high school, I know they're young, but look, teen pregnancy goes down, STIs go down, right? We're talking less hepatitis, right? We're talking less, AIDS. Well, all these consequences are good. Yeah, but that's assuming consequentialism is the right mode of moral evaluation, right? If you are an intuitive Kantian, right, which is often true across, there's like a weird political spectrum correlation here, right? Liberals tend to be consequentialists on lots of issues, and conservatives tend to be deontologists or more Kantians on issues, right? They'll say, yeah, but you're not supposed to have sex outside marriage, right? So if I giving kids condoms, I'm telling them it's okay, but it's not okay, and the consequences, the ends don't justify the means here, right? You guys know that, right? Liberals, you know that consequentialism is wrong, and of course, the other side are like, "What? Are you evil? Why are you hurting people?" Right? But they don't realize they're talking past each other, right? So the one side thinks the other one is stupid for not looking at their scientific studies showing that teen pregnancy goes down, yada yada yada. The other side thinks, right, the liberals are being immoral for like encouraging sex before marriage. But what they don't realize, they're actually just applying two different moral theories to the same problem, and they just view the other side as irrational, but they're not being irrational. They just have different views on what morality is, right? So probably the most famous utilitarian was Jeremy Bentham, and of course John Stuart Mill. So for the consequentialist or the utilitarian, the view is that you should evaluate the outcome of your actions in order to bring about the most good. And good is defined in psychological terms of we seek pleasure and avoid pain. Go back to the Epicureans, right? Whereas Kant says, forget outcomes. It's all about acting in accordance with the universal maxim, the universal duty, the law, the categorical imperative. Consequences don't matter. So, of course, big moral differences. On some stuff, believe the same stuff accidentally. On some issues, they'll come to the same conclusions. On other issues, they'll actually come apart, right? Harm reduction is a great example of these things, coming off really differently. So look at these slides here, because I'm going to give you a little bit about, these kind of different moral views. But the point is, Kant, his view of morality is grounded in rationality is ultimately an attempt to overcome Hume's problem. But in his attempt to overcome Hume's problem, he has to get rid of the idea of consequences as mattering, outcomes as mattering for morality at all. And there's other theories of this time period, like Mill and Bentham, who really strongly believe that consequences matter. And this applies to debates today. So hope that's something to think about here. For now, I'm going to sign off. Thanks for listening, and I'm off to my next live stream.